This is Think It Through with me, April A. Bear. Get ready to start thinking. I know, it's hard, and you'd probably rather not. But here we go anyway. Hello, and welcome to episode 7. This is going to be a continuation of our last episode where we looked at the different types of media, who owns them, different kinds of media content creators, and ethical standards, or lack thereof, of those owners and content creators. In this episode, we're going to move into a discussion of how to look at the media content we're consuming from an analytical viewpoint. That's known as media literacy, and it has to do with our ability to identify different kinds of media and understand the messages they're sending to us. Later, I'll be talking to Shanna Gilkeson, a doctoral candidate in media and communication at Bowling Green State University. But before I do, let's look at what constitutes media literacy. The first thing you need to know is that media messages aren't reality. They are constructed versions of reality. The version that's constructed depends on who is constructing it and who is its target audience. It's full of ideological, social, and political implications. But the way the messages are framed is designed to get us to see those messages as true. Another thing to know is that media content might inform, persuade, or entertain us, but that is not the main reason it exists. Now, if we get some kind of benefit from it, that's all well and good, but it's really naive to assume that's why it's there. Media content, whether it's print or digital, exists for the benefit of the corporations or people who own it. And that, of course, includes both news and social media outlets. Somewhere, someone is making money from it. It's not just there for our edification. Another thing you need to realize is that we are often, not always, but often, passive consumers of media. In other words, we simply take it in and just let it affect us. And that's what these corporations are counting on. Many media messages hit us in the fast-thinking areas of our brains, where all our cognitive biases and heuristics live. We also have a tendency to think that other people are more affected by it than we are, but that's just not true. It's much easier to see the bias in something that we disagree with than to see it in messages that resonate with us. So that's where media literacy comes in. It forces us to recognize that we definitely are affected by it. In looking critically at mediated messages, we can better understand them and be more aware of the ways in which we're affected by them. You might have been taught basic media literacy lessons in elementary or secondary school, and if you went to college, you probably had classes or workshops on how to do research. Traditionally, those of us who teach media literacy have our students look at some piece of media content like an article and ask basic questions like, who created it? Why did they create it? Who's the target audience for it? What kind of techniques does the creator use to get their point across? And how does it make you feel? Something that I've used for about a decade in my classes is called the CRAP test to determine if a source is good enough to be used for academic purposes. That's CRAAP. It's an acronym that stands for currency, relevance, authority, accuracy, and purpose. And the idea is that if it doesn't meet certain standards, it's crap and you shouldn't use it. Let's look at each of these standards. The first one is currency. Currency meaning how current is the information. When was it published? Has it been updated? Generally speaking, newer information is considered better than older information in most cases. Then there's relevance. Does this information help you or answer your question? Is it specifically related to your topic? Information specific to your needs is better than information that might be about the topic in general, but is not specific. The first A is authority. This has to do with the source, the author, the publisher of the information. Does this person or entity have the relevant qualifications like education, experience, or knowledge to speak to the topic? Does the URL give any clues about the creator of the information, like is it a .edu website or a .com or .gov website? Because those will give you clues to who is writing this information. The second A stands for accuracy, and that has to do with the truthfulness of the information. Is there evidence to back up what's being said? Can the information be verified with outside sources? Does the quality of the writing, the spelling, the grammar add to the belief that the information provided is most likely accurate? And finally, the purpose. What is the general purpose of this article? Is it to inform, persuade, or entertain? Is the specific purpose clear? In other words, what exactly is the main reason this media content exists? Would you categorize it as fact, opinion, or even propaganda? I'll post a link to the CRAP test in the show notes. It's pretty standard and it's not bad for scholarly usage, and frankly, it's been my go-to for a long time. However, my guest today has given me a lot to think about when it comes to not just teaching media literacy in class, but also applying these concepts to people outside of academia. People who might be at their wits' end trying to determine whether a source of information is credible and whether they should believe what that source is telling them. We had a great eye-opening conversation, and I'm very glad to be able to share it with you. Here we go. Thank you for joining me today, Shanna. Before we get started, and by the way, I have to tell you, I'm really excited about this discussion. Could you just briefly tell our listeners just a little bit about yourself, your areas of interest, and some of the classes that you teach?
Sure. Well, first of all, thank you for having me on. I'm really excited to be on your show today. My name is Shanna Gilkeson, and I am a PhD candidate at Bowling Green State University, studying media and communication. I currently am a part-time lecturer at Eastern Michigan University, and I teach television production and digital media and cinema studies courses. And I also teach part-time at Washtenaw Community College, where I also teach media and communication studies. My research is centered around gender, justice, and fandom, which means I look at fandom as a gendered space. People who are fans of things form communities, and I study those communities. And sometimes my research also takes me along the avenue of environmental justice. So I've written a bit about the Flint water crisis.
Wow, that's great. Obviously, you bring a lot of expertise and knowledge to this discussion, and I have to tell you that I always appreciate your posts on Facebook because so many of them actually speak to the things that I talk about in my class and on my podcast. Plus, of course, we share a love of all things nerdy, particularly Star Trek. And my listeners can't see you now, but Shanna has the background of the Enterprise D bridge as her Zoom background, and it makes me feel right at home. Okay, I initially had questions for you that were pretty basic about what media literacy is, why it's important, how we can incorporate it into our media usage on a daily basis. You know what I'm talking about, yeah. Right. Then I looked at the articles and particularly the video that you sent me, and I was just like, oh my gosh, this totally upends my whole view of this topic, which is great, by the way. Don't get me wrong, it's great. It just made me realize that we're going to have to approach it from a different angle, I think. As in, what I've been doing, I don't think it's effective any longer, if it ever was, and it's certainly not going to work out in the real world. So let's definitely start with traditionally what we think of as media literacy, and then we can move it into why it really isn't working, I think, and, maybe some things that we can do instead. So what is media literacy, or what does academia think of it?
Well, so coming from a background where my master's degree was in written communication with a concentration in teaching. And so a lot of what I learned was just basically what is literacy to begin with, right? And we automatically think of literacy as an ability to read or write. But really, you can have a lot of different kinds of literacy. Literacy in any discipline is essentially knowing what to do, how to do it, when to do it. So, you could, like, in fandom, I'm just going to, like, draw on that example because it's a low-hanging fruit for me. There is a literacy to being in a fan community, right? You know what kind of things you can post after a while if you're in an online community. You know what kind of things are probably going to get you flamed. You're going to, fandom polices itself, and you just kind of, like, learn these things as you go through your interaction. You know what kinds of stories your fellow fans like to read if you write fan fiction, that kind of thing. So even fandom has a literacy to it. There's a literacy to how to drive a car, all that kind of stuff. So when I was learning about literacy, this is the context I was learning about it in.
So as far as media goes, when we think about literacy, I mean, generally what we're thinking about are the things like who wrote it, who published it, is there any implicit or overt bias in it, that kind of thing, But why doesn't that, that's what I would do with my students. I'd say, here's a couple of websites. What can you tell me about these websites based on what you can see there, and what could you maybe look up to see if these things are valid and credible? And they were okay with that, but think about that in the context of today.
So I think part of the problem with why that isn't working anymore is we end up jumping down a rabbit hole in which we're learning all kinds of information that at the end of the day doesn't really matter, and it's also time consuming. And in this fast-paced world, what do we have less of? Patience, right? So, and I get impatient because I have these literacies, and with a few clicks of my keyboard, I can determine if a thing is true or not. And so I'm that person on the internet, and you've probably witnessed this personally, who just kind of goes off like, okay, people, this would have only taken you 3 seconds to look up. Why didn't you? But that's part of the literacy. They don't know to do that. That's one of the pieces of knowledge that's missing, is what to look up, how to look it up, and what information matters and what doesn't. So, one of the things that we're taught to privilege is currency, how recent the source came out. But if you look at lately, the news media in their race to be first sometimes don't always have all the facts, or they don't always have the facts correct. So yes, it might be the most recent thing about the issue that you're looking up, but it may not be right. In the case of Wikipedia, if it was just updated 10 minutes ago, but somebody did it as a hoax and put like a whole bunch of stuff that wasn't true, it might be, the yesterday version that's actually more helpful to you. So you have to know how to work your way around Wikipedia to see what matters there.
Even these days, people don't know what the Onion is, or the Empire News, or Babylon Bee, that kind of stuff. I just had to point that out to someone just yesterday.
Yeah.
They were quite upset with something they saw, and I was like, oh, no, you got to check the source. But even more than that, I think that part of the problem is that the media landscape is just so different for different groups of people. It's like we live on different planets, completely different sets of information that is being consumed by people on one side of a political issue, and completely different on the other side, to the point where they're not just getting different sets of information, but ideas about what qualifies as a fact. So someone on some conspiracy forum telling someone to go do the research, and I did the finger quotes, they mean something entirely different than when you and I tell a student to go do their research. We mean something that's light years away from what that person means.
For sure. And, it's a matter of really thinking about what question is it that we're asking. So if I'm looking at an article from Breitbart and I do all of these traditional things to try to determine credibility, how recently was this posted, who let's follow the money, who's paying for this, what is their stated agenda, blah, blah, blah. What that tells me is, if my question were, can I trust Breitbart? Then I would have an answer after that. But my question is usually, what is the thing Breitbart is saying? Is it true? We all know that a broken clock can be right twice a day. So if I'm looking at an article from Breitbart and if I see that they're reporting something and there's a bunch of text that's hyperlinked to like the sources of where they got their information, move upward in terms of where the information is coming from. Like, so say that they got the information from a newswire service like Associated Press or Reuters. Those are very reliable because they're very just the facts. There's no analysis, there's no opinion. It's just a thing happened, here's who was there, this is what somebody who was there said, that kind of thing. So you go up a level to Associated Press or Reuters, and there you can find out exactly what is true and exactly what is not. You don't need Breitbart anymore at that point.
You've taken the spin out of it or whatever and just gotten to the facts of the matter.
And getting closer to the primary source, right? So, but usually these kinds of news outlets that we like, even things that are maybe a little bit more credible up the chain, a lot of times they're tertiary sources at best. Maybe they're reporting on something that the Washington Post or the Hill said, and so then you have to go up a level to WAPO or the Hill, and then you have to see if there's another level to go up after that. So we're teaching them to determine if the website is credible, and that doesn't matter. What we need to teach them to do is be a fact checker, and this is how fact checkers work.
Okay, which leads me to this. This just happened to me this morning. I opened my phone and I'm scrolling through my Facebook feed, and apparently WhatsApp now linked to IFCN, that's the International Fact Checking News Site or something, and that's run by Pointer. So that's a pretty decent a fact-checking site. An ad for it came up in my newsfeed, and that ad had over 1,300 comments on it. So what do? I start scrolling through comments, which is never a good idea. But in this case, it really kind of opened my eyes because about 95% of those comments were negative comments about how fact checkers are all liberals, that any fact checker owned by Facebook, which this is not, by the way, couldn't be trusted. Lots of people said things like, I trust myself to know what's true. I don't need a fact checker to tell me, or I can do my own research, that kind of thing. I doubt that sincerely, but, people really do feel that way. So obviously there's a huge disconnect there. I mean, we can tell our students to go, utilize these fact checkers, but what do we do with people in the real world? I have to say I have no idea how many of those commenters were bots or trolls, and it could have been a very large percentage, but that mindset still exists. It's not like it's completely made up. It's there. People feel that way. There's so much doubt about the truthfulness of information out there in the general public. People start to rely on their own experiences and beliefs about the way the world works. And while that can get you through a lot of situations, it can't get you through everything,
For sure. And so, again, that's where other literacies come in, or other aspects, things that we need to include in these literacies. I mean, here's the thing. I don't have any of the answers, and there are people out there who research this stuff and know way more about it than I do. I'm just the instructor who's there in the trenches. who was spinning my wheels, trying to figure out, like, okay, there's got to be a tool that I'm missing that I can give these students. They've been asking me, hey, can we do a unit on fake news? And I started showing them the Dana Boyd video that I sent to you. I actually had them watch it because I wanted them to understand why I was throwing up my hands and saying, you know what, I got nothing. If the leading expert on this stuff is saying, oh, gee, I don't know, there's no reason why I would have these answers, right?
No, that's true. I wasn't trying to pick.
No. So just so that way your listeners understand where I'm coming from,
Yeah.
I'm starting to incorporate the other things from the articles that I sent you in terms of teaching them that they're, how to be a fact checker, and teaching them, like, how to, okay, well, you don't know if this fact-checking thing is accurate, so let's use the internet to see what other people are saying about this fact-checker, but, credible places, right? Not Billy Bob on his YouTube channel. But,
do you think it's possible that a person, I think that fact checkers do have access, to a lot of primary sources and stuff that maybe just your basic person researching on the internet might not have, or could they find that? If they were like, I don't need a fact checker, I can just do it myself. What do you think that they should do? And I know that the answers, some of those answers are in those articles that I will post in my show notes, because it was really, really helpful information. But how would you go about fact checking something?
So for me personally, I do start with some of those basic old school questions, heuristic checklists to see. So first of all, I look at what the website is. And it might be one that I know about and I already know how credible or how much I can trust it, or whether it skews conservative or whether it skews liberal. But if I'm not familiar with the site, one thing I might do is use one of those resources I gave you with the media bias chart. And I would see where it falls, in the spectrum on that chart, just to kind of, because the thing is that you might have knowledge about a website, but there are always individual articles that are outliers. There are particular authors that might be outliers. So, if you're dealing with something that has a heavy partisan bias, that doesn't mean that everything that comes out of there is wrong,
right,
or inaccurate.
Right. You can't just just throw away an entire news source just because some of the information is bad. Right,
yeah. So, it's like, am I always automatically skeptical of Fox News? Yes, but I also know that sometimes it's okay, and I just have to learn how. So that's why I don't really waste my time determining if I can trust Fox News. I look at the reporting. I look at the items inside the article that are hyperlinked. And this is a big one that a lot of people can't seem to wrap their heads around. You have to keep going after the headline.
Yeah, that's one of the things that people, they look at the headline, they make a determination about its truthfulness or helpfulness, or, if it fits in their worldview, and they will just go ahead and post it. And, if they kind of even just read the article, their opinion of that may have changed, or they might find some information that they need to look further into. And I'm a big fan of hyperlinks. If I'm reading an article, I will click on all of them just to see where it takes me, And
that's what you need to do. For academics like us, the hyperlinks basically perform the same function as an in-text citation.
Yes.
So you're telling the reader where you got your information and where they can look to find out more. So chances are, if we're going up a level to like Fox News or MSNBC or CNN, chances are they got it from someplace else. Their article is going to be hyperlinked within. If there are no hyperlinks in there, automatically be skeptical. Right. Because they're not telling you where they got it. They're not telling you how to go look at it and decide for yourself. They just, you're just supposed to accept what's there in the text. But, if Fox News or MSNBC is posting an article, they're going to have hyperlinks for where they got their information. Click those links. Guess what? After that point, you don't need Fox News anymore. You don't need MSNBC anymore. You can read those sources that are more closer to the origin.
They may not be the primary source, but they are much closer to the origin of the event.
And you might have to go another level above that. You might have to go several levels above that. But typically, it's only going to take you a few minutes, especially if you're dealing with one of the more major news reporting sources.
Yeah, I did notice that one of the authors of the articles that you sent me was talking about how people will spend hours basically looking for the wrong things, trying to figure out what's going on with an individual article. It's not because they're unintelligent. They're probably highly intelligent, but they're just looking in the wrong places. And they also maybe need a better understanding of how the internet works. A lot of people don't get it.
The internet and the world in general. One of those articles gave an example of the Fukushima Daisies.
Yes.
There's these mutant daisies that apparently appear other places in the world and aren't just because of Fukushima radiation. But in order to properly investigate this, first of all, you would have to know that Fukushima was in Japan. And if you don't know that, which, people who were tiny kids when it happened, they might not know that or have reason to know that. So we have to really think about things that we take for granted. I know Fukushima's in Japan. I was an adult when it happened, and I even know enough about Japanese language and culture to hear that word and guess, oh, that's probably a Japanese name, right? But a lot of people who haven't had that kind of exposure to the world yet would not know that. So we have to kind of figure out, okay, you don't know what you don't know.
Right.
And the students don't know what they don't know.
That is correct. And yeah, I think that we tend to forget that. I do. I forget that sometimes. But that's a very common fallacy, that other people have the same level of knowledge about the world as I do, which is obviously not the case. And people will look at a website and think it's perfectly fine, that it doesn't contain any bias whatsoever. But if you look at it, you see all these symbols and words and stuff like that, and you're like, oh no, this is obviously like a white supremacist website. And they're like, I don't see it. I don't see it. But it's only because they have generally nothing to do with that particular group of people, so they don't know what those symbols look like. They don't know what the words are that they use. So, if you really want to understand something, you do have to do the research.
Right. That's how misinformation works too. Like, it will often attach it to something that is true or that we do view as good, and then kind of keep pushing things a little further. The way QAnon has attached itself to child trafficking, right?
Yes.
Like, okay, saving children, who wouldn't want to do that? That's obviously a good thing, but they've co-opted that. Number one, this is a population of people who can't push back against your intentions and what you're doing, and you're daring to speak for them, right? So these people who are being human trafficked might not even know that this is happening, right? They can't push back against this. Right. But then, they've got all this other like conspiracy theory tin hat stuff going on, but therefore saving these children so they can't be bad, right?
And then if you say, well, that's not true, then you're part of the problem. That's all. Mm-hmm. That's a whole other issue. Yeah. That, hey, we should talk about that in a different episode. Okay. It's a date. One of the things that I like to tell my students is that, when you see something like a headline or whatever, and you have an immediate gut reaction, that you need to stop right there. Don't just, either deny it or reject it or accept it or whatever at that point based on your immediate reaction. That once you do that, that's when you really need to slow down and start to think about all the ways that you can find out, what is true about this particular piece of information.
For sure. And, that's always a good place to start. The main thing, though, is to keep going, keep reading, keep clicking on those links. And, maybe even before you do that, sit with it and say, okay, why am I reacting this way? Where is this coming from?
Yeah, good idea. Now, you talked about the media bias interactive chart, which again, I'll post the show notes. But do you have any other sources that you are kind of a go-to for you, because you just know that they're gonna tell you what is true and what is not?
Well, in terms of where I get my news, you mean?
Yeah, like news, information.
So I've typically found I listen to a lot of NPR because I have nearly an hour commute to and from work on the days that I'm in person. And, they might, if you look at the chart, they are just so a little bit to the left of center. So they're pretty reliable. If I click on an article from The Hill, I know that it can be trusted. I mean, here's the thing. They can be slightly left or right and still be reliable. What makes them left and right might be editorial decisions in terms of what stories to feature, or maybe a little bit of analysis. You're always going to get bias when there's analysis, period, because you have to have a philosophical framework to analyze these things from. So you cannot have a bias-free analysis. It's impossible.
Right.
So just because there is some bias there, I don't know, I kind of feel like we need to stop treating bias like a dirty word. That's another thing that I see my students doing. It's like, okay, well, just because there's a bias there doesn't mean that it's bad. I'll show them a documentary that is kind of, that's supposed to give voice to people who ordinarily wouldn't get their voices included on an issue. And when they react to it, they'll be like, well, this was heavily biased. Well, okay, yes, it is a point of view documentary, but we live the other side of the story every day. It's not this filmmaker's job to tell you what you already know. So we have to rethink of how we're talking about bias.
Right. Well, yeah, bias is a perspective, but that's not as important as whether the information is factual,
right,
based in reality.
and if they are trying to persuade you to think a certain way, there are certain rhetorical structures of persuasion that are ethical and fair, and then there's unfair persuasion.
Yeah.
And that's when you start getting into the really loaded language and the 8,000 exclamation points and the super sensationalistic headline and all that kind of stuff. So even if they're trying to persuade you, that's not necessarily a bad thing. They are just trying to get you to identify with their perspective. And maybe you walk away from it agreeing and thinking, oh, snap, I didn't really know that other people went through this or thought that. Or you might walk away still thinking what you thought before, but at least now you know where the other people are coming from.
And as far, so you talked about The Hill and what was the other one?
NPR.
Yeah. I listen to it all the time. Do you have any fact-checking sites? Do you think that some are better than others, or?
Snopes is usually my go-to, because they work fast, for one thing, and they've been pretty reliable. So if I can't find an issue on Snopes, I'll just kind of Google an issue and see in general who else is saying what about it, and I'll kind of eyeball okay, what is this, that's when the other questions, the old crap test and all that stuff come in. It's like that's when I start concerning myself with, okay, well, what is this website's agenda, who's paying for this, that kind of thing. But otherwise, I almost always get a hit on Snopes, or I can almost always find some kind of reliable, fair news site that will talk about it. And if I can't find anything at all, that's when the BS alarm goes off, and I'm just kind of like, okay, if this is literally the only place that's talking about this, I am seriously going to reserve judgment on this. It might be just that it'll take a couple days for the story to catch, but that's really when you need to be patient and say, okay, I need to know more before I can make my mind up about this.
Well, a good reporter does that anyway. They don't just like jump on something. They're like, I got to get the facts and make sure that everything checks out before I go ahead and, put this out there. So thank you. I mean, I think that you shouldn't feel so, not hopeless, but like you're not quite sure how to go about this, because I think you have all the tools at your disposal. And I have to tell you, I have to say thank you for all those articles that you sent me. Those are some really great resources, and I'm gonna do some more deep diving into that. But yeah, I think that somebody has to want to really know the truth to start this detective work that it takes to get to see whether a piece of information is true or not. And some people don't care. They just go, oh, I believe this, or this fits with my worldview, so I'm going to share it, that kind of thing. But frankly, if anyone truly cares about the information that they're passing on, that they're sharing on social media, it kind of behooves you to click those links and see where this information is coming from, and even if it sounds good, is it really good? Is it good information?
Yeah, and it can also help you filter out, like if you're going up a level to something that's a little less analytical, it can help you see, okay, well, the information is true, but I can see where this other website was maybe trying to unfairly persuade me to think one way or the other about it.
Right. I really like that. It's because it's kind of like taking a step back when you have to slow down and stop your gut reaction and then take a step back, or you said go up a level. And see how close you can get to the actual event that sparked this article or this piece of information in the first place. I think that can go a long way to helping us not to be throwing information out there that we might like, but really isn't true. And in the end, if it's not true, it really doesn't serve us, It doesn't support anything.
Exactly. So the next step for me, I think, is coming up with a more formalized lesson plan to teach this particular stuff, and come up with some meaningful activities to help them practice mindfulness with it.
Yes, absolutely. Thank you very much for your amazing input today, and we're gonna do that conspiracy theory one.
It's on. I love it. Let's do it.
Awesome. Thanks again.
Thank you so much.
I hope you got as much out of that interview as I did. Let's do a quick summary of some of the things that Shanna and I discussed. First, media literacy includes basic literacy skills and internet literacy skills, and some general background knowledge about how the world works. I think a lot of people are unfortunately more dependent on the internet and mediated information than they are knowledgeable about those things. And that's a big problem. I'll link to an article Shanna provided that talks about all the kinds of literacy necessary to be a truly good consumer of information in today's world. The second thing that struck me was that currency, or how current the information is not necessarily the best indicator of how good an article is. That news article could have been rushed to publication and had mistakes, so the most up-to-date information may not be the most accurate. Another thing, always check the source to make sure it isn't something that puts out intentionally incorrect information. Those are usually satire sites. Even President Trump retweeted an article from the satire website Babylon Bee, and his comment on it made it pretty clear that he didn't realize it was satire. Yep, that happened. There are also news aggregators that simply repost articles without doing any checking at all to make sure that the information in them is correct, so be careful about that. Now, while actual research can be fairly involved, Shanna says, and I agree, that it may not serve your purpose. If that purpose is to quickly find out if the information in an article that you read on a website or on social media is true before you share it on Facebook. I posted a link to author Mike Caulfield's quick and easy web literacy model that involves just 3 steps. The first step, check to see if the claims have been previously fact-checked, because why would you redo all the work if somebody already did it for you? The second step is to go upstream to the original source. As Shanna said, find where the article's author got their information. Who are they citing? Then go up a step to the original information and check it. And the third step is to read laterally. Now, that means that if the original source is not one that you know well enough to trust, that you look at that source to see if it's credible. Now, depending on your political preference, you may or may not have a good impression of fact-checking sites. If you're not too keen on them, it might behoove you to go to one of them anyway and find the page on their website that explains how they determine the bias of sources and the accuracy of claims, which is probably titled Methodology or something like that. They stick very closely to the process because it's in their best interest to make the most accurate determination of whether the information is fully true or if parts of it are true and other parts aren't, which parts those are, or if it's pretty much all false. But of course, these fact checkers are humans after all, with their own cognitive biases. And while they might be more aware of those biases than most people because of what they do for a living, it doesn't mean they can filter that out entirely. I'm going to link to a really good NPR interview that discusses this very thing. If indeed you insist on doing your own actual research, remember, it's not just thinking, ooh, this article sounds right to me, and then looking for information that would justify your feelings about it. That's called confirmation bias, and I talked about it in episode 1. Good research involves slowing down, not responding immediately to your gut reaction, looking at who wrote the article, what do you know or can find out about that source. Look at what the article's saying, what's the main idea, where did they get that information. That's critical because you need to, as Shanna says, go up a level to the original source of the information to see if it was stated correctly in the article. Did the author get all the facts right? Maybe some of them, but not all of them? Or did they totally misinterpret the context or what was said or what happened? That's where bias comes in, implicit, political, social. What is this article trying to get you to believe? Again, bias isn't necessarily a bad thing, but if the actual facts that are being reported simply don't match up with the original source, that's a problem. Now you can go back and look at what kind of responses, thoughts, feelings, behaviors that you might be experiencing based on your research. Do you feel differently than you did when you first read the article? You might have been angry about the article at first because of what it was about. Then, after you did some research, you might still be angry, but this time it's because you realized the article was total bullshit. And that's all for this episode. Don't forget to check out the show notes, and I'll see you in episode 8.